In a Seattle federal courtroom in March of 2026, a judge looked across the room at a man who had once been trusted with $35 million of other people's money. United States District Judge Tana Lin sentenced Nevin Shetty to 2 years in federal prison. She ordered him to repay the full amount to the company he had systematically stripped of its cash reserves. She barred him from serving as an officer or director of any company without explicit permission. 60 people had already lost their jobs. This is the story of how a trusted CFO, facing the end of his career at one company, decided to secretly move that company's cash reserves into a platform he personally controlled, and what happened to those funds when the market collapsed beneath them, and how, for more than 3 years, the full weight of what he had done was still working its way through the courts. Rewind to the beginning. This is The Reckoning Files, investigative documentaries about betrayal and what happens when the truth finally catches up. By the early 2020s, the e-commerce infrastructure space was one of the most aggressively funded sectors in American tech. Companies across the country were building the back-end plumbing that allowed online retailers to manage inventory, process orders, and scale their operations without rebuilding from scratch every time they grew. Fabric, formerly incorporated as Commerce Fabric Inc., was one of those companies. Based in Seattle, Washington, Fabric had carved out a position in this space as a serious player. It had raised substantial venture capital across multiple rounds, including a significant Series A and later a Series C, attracting institutional investors who saw the infrastructure play as a durable bet. On February 24, 2022, Fabric announced a $140 million Series C funding round, led by SoftBank, at a valuation of approximately $1.5 billion. The company described itself as the AWS for commerce. It had 300 employees. By any external measure, Fabric looked exactly like what it was supposed to be: a unicorn, a growth stage startup that had just become one of the most valuable private companies in Seattle. If you had seen it from the outside, a billion-dollar valuation, a SoftBank lead, 300 employees building infrastructure for the next generation of e-commerce, you would have seen exactly what it was designed to look like: a company on the verge of something significant. When a company reaches that stage, somewhere between scrappy startup and genuine enterprise, one of the most critical hires you'll see them make is the chief financial officer. Not a bookkeeper, not a controller, a CFO, the person responsible for financial strategy, cash management, investor relations, and treasury operations. The person the board, the CEO, and every investor look to when they need to know how the money is being handled. In March of 2021, Fabric hired Nevin Shetty as its CFO. What does that hire look like from the outside? It looks like a company that is getting serious. Shetty came in as the kind of hire that signals a company is getting serious. CFOs at this level don't just run spreadsheets. They set the financial architecture that will carry the company through its next phase of growth. They sit in on board meetings. They have direct access to the company's bank accounts. They are, by definition, among the most trusted people inside the building. At Fabric, Shetty was given that access. He had signatory authority over the company's accounts at JPMorgan Chase. He participated in drafting the company's formal investment policy, the document that governed where Fabric's cash reserves could be placed and under what conditions. Who better to write a treasury policy than the man who will be responsible for following it? That policy was specific. It called for conservative US dollar-denominated fixed income instruments, money market products, safe, liquid, boring holdings. The kind of thing that produces 2 or 3% annually and never appears in financial news. If you've ever read a corporate treasury policy, you know exactly what this language looks like. Conservative, low risk, boring on purpose. Fabric wasn't speculating. It was protecting its runway. And Shetty was the man they trusted to do that. In early 2022, Fabric's board developed concerns about Nevin Shetty's performance. By March, the company's chief operating officer had informed him that he could not continue in the role. Over the following weeks, Fabric and Shetty worked out the terms of a formal transition. A separation agreement was prepared, the document that would officially mark the end of his time at the company. He was not immediately removed. He remained at the company. He still had access to the accounts. Think about that sequence. The decision had been made, the paperwork was being drawn up, and he still had the access codes. 7 days after that announcement, on March 31st, 2022, the separation agreement was signed. The next morning was April 1st. What happened over the 12 days that followed cost Fabric $35 million. It cost 60 people their jobs, before the transfers, before the decision. There was Hightower Treasury. Hightower Treasury was a cryptocurrency investment platform. It was not affiliated with Fabric. It was not a publicly known company. It was, according to federal prosecutors, an entity that Nevin Shetty owned and controlled, or co-owned and co-controlled. A side operation, one that notably he had never disclosed to his employer. The arrangement, as described in the government's indictment, worked like this. Hightower would accept capital, invest it in cryptocurrency and decentralized finance products, and in return pay the capital provider a fixed return of 6% annually on the funds placed. Hightower would keep anything earned above that rate, up to 20% annually, 6% on $35 million. You do that math, $2,100,000 per year, flowing back to the capital source, with Hightower retaining everything above that rate in what could have been a highly lucrative arrangement. Here is the problem, and you already know what it is. Fabric did not know about it. No board member, no CEO, no investor, no other officer. According to federal prosecutors, not a single person at Commerce Fabric Inc. had authorized, approved, or even been told that the company's treasury was about to be moved into a cryptocurrency platform controlled by their own CFO. How do you move $35 million out of a company without telling anyone? You wait until you have the access codes and no one is watching closely enough to stop you. We started this documentary in a Seattle federal courtroom. A judge, a sentence, 60 people who had already lost their jobs. You heard the end before you heard the beginning, because that is the only way this story lands correctly. Now we're inside the mechanism. This is where the $35 million actually moved. Between April 1st and April 12th, 2022, 12 days, Nevin Shetty executed a series of wire transfers from Fabric's accounts at JPMorgan Chase. Court records show that on April 5th, Shetty was physically present at a Chase Bank branch on Mercer Island, the Seattle suburb where he lived, approximately 1 hour before authorizing one of the 4 transfers. He drove to the bank, he walked in, he moved the money. There is nothing abstract about that sentence. You can place him at the branch. You can trace the decision. The transfers were systematic. They totaled exactly $35,100,000. Every dollar went to accounts held by Hightower Treasury, the platform Shetty controlled, the platform no one at Fabric had heard of, the platform he had never disclosed. At this point, Fabric's cash reserves, money raised from investors to fund operations, payroll, product development, and growth, had effectively been liquidated and redirected to a cryptocurrency account under the private control of the man who was in the process of being forced out of the company. He was still on payroll, he still had the access codes, and the money was already gone. The defense would later argue that the transfers were not theft, that Shetty had genuinely believed Hightower Treasury was a legitimate investment vehicle, one that fell within the scope of Fabric's investment policy, that the losses were not the product of fraud but of catastrophic market conditions, that he was not a thief acting against the company's interests, but a financial officer who made a high-risk bet that went wrong. The prosecution's answer was the timeline. And what does the timeline tell you? Shetty was in the process of being forced out of the company. The separation agreement had been signed. He had authorized every transfer during the 12 days between the signing and his formal departure. He had built or co-built the platform he was sending the company's money into. He had never disclosed that platform to a single person at Fabric, not to the CEO, not to the board, not to anyone whose approval might have interrupted the transfer. The government's position was direct. A CFO who genuinely believed he was making a legitimate investment on behalf of his employer does not execute those transfers in his last days of authorized access. He does not keep the receiving platform secret. He does not move $35 million to an entity he personally controls without telling anyone. The timing was not a coincidence. The jury, after hearing both versions of the story, agreed with the government. What Hightower did with Fabric's funds was invest them in decentralized finance products and in instruments tied to Terra USD, commonly known as UST, a so-called algorithmic stablecoin built on the Terra/Luna blockchain ecosystem. If you followed cryptocurrency markets in 2022, you know exactly where this is going. In the spring of 2022, Terra USD was one of the largest stablecoins in the world by market capitalization. It had been designed to maintain a $1 peg through an algorithmic relationship with its sister token, Luna. The design had been celebrated in crypto circles as innovative, a stablecoin that didn't require a dollar sitting in a bank for every dollar issued. It relied instead on market mechanics and incentive structures to hold the peg. On May 9th, 2022, Less than 4 weeks after Shetty's transfers were completed, the Terra USD peg began to break. Within days, UST had lost most of its value. Luna, the token designed to stabilize it, entered a hyperinflationary death spiral. Billions of dollars in value evaporated across the Terra ecosystem in under 72 hours. By May 13, 2022, the value of what had been placed in Fabric's treasury was, according to federal prosecutors, nearly zero. The Terra collapse was not a minor correction. It was one of the most catastrophic events in the history of cryptocurrency markets. An estimated $40 billion in market capitalization was wiped out across the Terra ecosystem in under a week. Millions of retail investors, people who had put savings into what had been marketed as a stable, yield-bearing asset, lost everything. Do Kwon, the Korean entrepreneur who had built and promoted the Terra/Luna ecosystem, would later face fraud charges in multiple jurisdictions. That is the environment into which Fabric's treasury had been placed. Not a high-risk stock, not a volatile but legitimate fund, an algorithmic stablecoin, whose creator would eventually be charged with securities fraud. Into that, Shetty had placed $35 million of other people's money. We're not talking about a speculative play that went sideways. We're talking about company payroll, product development, the money that was supposed to keep 60 people employed. The money that was supposed to fund salaries, product development, and the next chapter of Fabric's growth was gone. That collapse is what forced the discovery. At some point in May 2022, Fabric discovered what had happened to its treasury. The details of exactly how the company discovered the missing funds, whether it was a reconciliation, an internal audit, a bank statement review, are not fully detailed in the public record. What is documented is what the company did next. Fabric reported the embezzlement to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That report set in motion a federal investigation. The FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Washington began building a case. Shetty was fired. For more than a year, federal investigators traced the wire transfers. They documented the JP Chase transactions. They mapped the movement of funds to Hightower Treasury. They obtained search warrants and production orders. They built a record. On May 17, 2023, 13 months after the final transfer, a federal grand jury in Seattle returned an indictment against Nevin Shetty, 4 counts of wire fraud. 8 days later, on May 25, 2023, Shetty appeared before the court and entered a plea of not guilty. 13 months separated the final transfer from the indictment. That gap was not inactivity. It was architecture. Wire fraud prosecutions do not succeed on narrative alone. They require documentation, specific accounts, specific amounts, specific dates, specific authorizations, every dollar traced, every transfer logged, every chain of custody established beyond reasonable doubt. Federal investigators spent that year constructing exactly that record. Bank records from JP Chase establishing the movement of funds out of Fabric's corporate accounts. Records showing where those funds went, the accounts and entities that received the transfers. Wire confirmation documentation for each of the 4 counts underlying the indictment. The investment policy itself, the document Shetty had helped draft, and physical evidence placing Shetty at the Mercer Island branch of JP Chase approximately 1 hour before authorizing one of the transfers. Hold on, because that last item deserves a moment. The investment policy, the document that spelled out in writing exactly where Fabric's cash reserves could go and where they could not, was a document Nevin Shetty had helped write. He had helped design the protection. He had helped define the rules. He had sat at the table when the policy was drafted, and he had participated in building the safeguard that was supposed to prevent exactly what he then went ahead and did. The government placed that document in front of the jury and said, this man knew the policy. He understood the policy. He helped create it. And then in 12 days, he violated every line of it, without disclosing it, without authorization, without telling a single person at the company he was supposed to protect. By the spring of 2023, the government was ready to move. After Shetty entered his not guilty plea, the case entered the pre-trial litigation phase. It would remain there for more than 2 additional years. As motions were filed, evidence was disclosed, and both sides built their trial positions. The case that followed was not swift. It was not simple. Shetty's defense attorneys mounted a serious legal challenge that stretched over more than 2 years of pre-trial litigation. The defense made 2 primary arguments. The first was that Fabric's investment policy, the same document Shetty had helped draft, contained language that, the defense argued, permitted certain exceptions to the conservative fixed income requirement, that Shetty had the authority, under that policy, to approve the placement of funds in instruments like Hightower's crypto treasury. The second was structural. Shetty was the CFO. He had signatory authority. He had the access codes. The transfers were executed through legitimate banking channels with his authorized credentials. The defense framed the government's case as an attempt to criminalize a financial decision that was, at worst, a breach of fiduciary duty, not a federal crime. The defense also sought, at one point, to have Do Kwon, the founder of the Terra/Luna ecosystem, and himself a subject of international fraud proceedings, testify on Shetty's behalf. The court denied that request in September of 2025. The case finally went to trial in the fall of 2025, 3.5 years after the transfers that started it all. The government presented its case methodically. Jurors heard the JP Chase wire transfer records. They heard evidence about Hightower Treasury, what it was, who controlled it, and what it had done with Fabric's funds. Prosecutors argued that Shetty had brazenly schemed to steal company funds for his own personal enrichment, that the $35 million was never disclosed to Fabric, never authorized by Fabric, and was moved during the specific window when Shetty still had access. The defense held its position. Shetty's attorneys continued to argue that he had acted within the scope of his authority, that the investment policy permitted his actions, and that what the government called fraud was, at its core, a financial decision that had gone catastrophically wrong during a market collapse that destroyed billions in value globally, not just Fabric's $35 million. Both versions of the story were placed before the jury. In November of 2025, after a full trial before a jury in the Western District of Washington, Nevin Shetty was found guilty. 4 counts of wire fraud, all 4 counts. The jury had heard the government's case, the investment policy, the wire transfers, the JP records, the Hightower accounts, the collapse of the Terra USD position, the near total loss of company funds, and they had concluded unanimously that this was not a financial misjudgment, it was fraud. Before sentencing, there is something that belongs in the record, separate from the verdict, separate from the sentence, but essential to understanding the full cost of what happened. 60 people, in the wake of the discovery, in the months after Fabric found out that its treasury had been emptied, the company laid off approximately 60 employees, not executives, not board members, not the investors who had funded the rounds. 60 workers, people who had taken a job at a startup because they believed in what the company was building, people who had shown up, done their work, met their deliverables, and had no idea that the man responsible for protecting the company's finances was secretly redirecting those finances into a cryptocurrency platform he personally controlled. Think about what you'd hear on that day. Not the full story, but a company announcement about restructuring, about difficult decisions, about the market. They didn't authorize the transfers. They didn't know about Hightower. They had no seat at the table where those decisions were made. When the money was gone, their jobs went with it. The restitution order names the financial loss. These 60 people are the human ledger behind that number. The following March 2026, Shetty stood before United States District Judge Tana Lin for sentencing. Judge Lin sentenced him to 2 years in federal prison. She ordered him to pay restitution, the precise amount transferred. She imposed 3 years of supervised release, and she added a special condition. Shetty was barred from serving as an officer or director of any company without the explicit approval of his probation officer. The prosecution had asked for 9 years. At sentencing, Judge Lin said the losses had, and I quote, significant and severe effects on the company. She noted that Shetty's actions had, in her words, almost put the company out of business. Prosecutors said Shetty had brazenly schemed to line his own pockets with his employer's money. The FBI noted he had stolen funds his employer intended to keep in conservative investments to help grow the company. Defense counsel submitted letters of support at sentencing, including one from Shetty's ex-wife, who said she had lost her own life savings in the collapse and still supported him. Defense attorneys requested probation or home confinement. The court declined. Defense counsel announced an intent to appeal. The restitution order is $35,100,000. It is a legal obligation written into the sentencing record of the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington. It carries the weight of federal law. It is worth being honest about what that means in practice. Nevin Shetty will not emerge from 2 years in federal prison with $35 million. The restitution order is real. Enforcement in the short term is a different matter. These cases move slowly. Collection depends on assets. The company that was harmed harmed will pursue it through the courts. That is the legal reality of wire fraud restitution in cases where the money is gone. What happened to Fabric after the discovery is a matter of partial public record. The company lost its treasury in a 12-day window in April of 2022. Within months, it laid off approximately 60 employees. A company that had just closed a $140 million Series C at a $1.5 billion valuation. A company that had described itself as the AWS for commerce was now operating with a fractured workforce and a leadership vacancy that no amount of external capital could fully repair overnight. Whether Fabric survived at scale, whether the company rebuilt, restructured, or quietly reduced its ambitions is not fully captured in the public record. What is documented is the sequence, the transfers, the collapse, the layoffs, and the years of federal proceedings that followed. The damage was done before the indictment was filed. The reckoning came after. Here is what stays with me from this case, and I think it will stay with you too. Nevin Shetty did not break into Fabric's accounts. He was not a hacker. He was not a stranger who found a vulnerability. He was the person the company had hired to protect its money. And he had helped write the document that was supposed to make sure its money was never put at risk. The investment policy he helped draft was designed to prevent exactly what he did. Conservative instruments, dollar-denominated, low risk, a safeguard built by the same hands that would eventually violate it. The crypto community will debate whether the Terra collapse made Shetty a criminal or simply an investor who lost a bet. The jury in Seattle was clear on that question. But does the Terra collapse change what he did? Does it matter whether the money was lost in a crash or simply kept? The transfers were unauthorized either way. But the deeper issue this case surfaces is not about cryptocurrency. It is about the architecture of trust inside organizations and how completely that architecture can fail when the person who is supposed to enforce it decides not to. Shetty had the keys because organizations have to give someone the keys. There is no version of a functioning CFO that doesn't have access to the bank accounts. The question the people at Fabric couldn't have known to ask, the question you can't ask until it's already too late, was, what happens when the person we gave the keys to decides to use them for himself? 60 people found out the answer to that question without choosing to ask it. If this story stayed with you, hit like, subscribe to @The Reckoning Files 20, and turn on notifications so you never miss an investigation. New documentaries drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.